Studios in Los Angeles. Brian Wilson, Dennis Wilson, Carl Wilson, Mike Love, Al Jardine, and Dennis, maybe you'd like to start this off. Why do you think that you've had such, continued popularity? We're keeping you awake?
I'm borrowing my brother Carl's microphone. Is this ABC?
Yeah.
You need a new microphone.
What do you listen to when you're at home?
I listen to a record called Be My Baby by the Ronettes.
Dennis Wilson's story begins with a contradiction so haunting, it almost feels like it was written for a Hollywood tragedy. He was the only true surfer in the Beach Boys, the drummer who gave their music its heartbeat, and the man whose wild spirit embodied everything the band claimed to represent. Yet behind the sunny harmonies and the California dream, Dennis lived a life filled with chaos, self-destruction, and moments of brilliance. So raw that even his family didn't always recognize their worth. His life reads like a novel that shifts between a celebration of beauty and an exploration of the darkest corners of the human soul. And when it ended suddenly, violently, and far too soon, it left behind unanswered questions, broken hearts, and a legacy that is only now being fully understood. But how does a man who helped create some of the most joyful music of the 20th century end up drowning, literally and figuratively, in the very ocean that inspired him? To understand Dennis Wilson's life, we need to start not with the legend of the Beach Boys, but with the troubled boy he once was, and the family that both made and broke him. Dennis Carl Wilson was born on December 4, 1944, in Inglewood, California, the middle child of Murray and Audrey Wilson. His brothers Brian and Carl would become central to the Beach Boys, and together the three siblings, each with a different role, formed the backbone of one of the most influential American bands of all time. Dennis was the least musically gifted in the traditional sense. He didn't have Brian's genius or Carl's pitch-perfect voice, but he had something none of the others did, an untamed energy and an authenticity that perfectly matched the band's image. From the beginning, Dennis was a wild child. He was athletic, rough around the edges, and impulsive. While Brian would sit at the piano writing songs and Carl would quietly observe, Dennis was surfing, fighting, running, and living like he had no fear. He was the kid who'd skip class to spend the entire day at the beach, the teenager who would punch first and apologize later. This rawness made him both magnetic and dangerous. Their father, Murray Wilson, was a frustrated musician who lived out his dreams through his children, but he was also abusive, domineering, and at times sadistic. The Wilson boys endured physical and emotional abuse that scarred them for life. Murray's obsession with control and discipline clashed violently with Dennis's free spirit, where Brian learned to escape inward into music and Carl chose diplomacy. Dennis fought back with rebellion. The tension at home created a fractured emotional foundation for all three brothers, but Dennis seemed to internalize it the most. His need for freedom was so strong that even as a child he lived like someone who didn't believe he'd grow old.
Los Angeles authorities this morning will perform an autopsy on the body of Dennis Wilson, the Beach Boys drummer and one of the singing group's founders.
Officials say he was found in less than 15 feet of water.
Ironically, it was Dennis, the least musically inclined of the three, who set the course of history for the Beach Boys. One day, when the brothers were experimenting with harmonies, Dennis casually suggested that they write songs about surfing, since that was what he actually did every day. Brian and their cousin Mike Love took the idea and ran with it, creating the surf rock sound that would soon define California in the public imagination. Dennis didn't realize it at the time, but that offhand suggestion would ignite a cultural phenomenon. Without him, the Beach Boys might have become just another doo-wop act. Instead, they became the voice of endless summers, freedom, and youth. When the Beach Boys formed in 1961, Dennis was slotted in as the drummer. He wasn't trained and often relied on session musicians to handle the more complex parts. But Dennis gave the band something they couldn't fake: authenticity. He was the real surfer, the tanned, blonde Californian that teenage fans imagined when they heard Surfin' Safari or Catch a Wave. The Irony was that while he embodied their image, the music itself often excluded him creatively. Brian was the mastermind, Carl the instrumentalist, Mike the frontman, and Dennis the wild, good-looking brother who looked like the poster boy but was rarely taken seriously. This imbalance fueled a lifelong insecurity in Dennis, one that would both drive him to prove himself and push him towards self-destruction. Despite his insecurities, Dennis became the band's breakout star in terms of charisma. Women adored him, and his presence on stage often overshadowed the more musically central members of the band. He married young, divorced young, and quickly earned a reputation as a ladies' man. His relationships were turbulent, passionate, and often destructive. But what most people didn't realize was that behind the confident exterior, Dennis carried deep pain. He craved love and acceptance, but he often sabotaged himself with impulsive choices and a growing reliance on alcohol and drugs. The mid-1960s were a golden era for the Beach Boys. Brian Wilson reached creative peaks with albums like Pet Sounds and songs like God Only Knows became instant classics. But while Brian was retreating into the studio, Dennis was exploring life outside the band. He made friends with Hollywood actors, hung out at parties, and chased thrills with an intensity that worried those around him. He had an openness that drew people in, and that openness led him down paths that would change his life forever. None more notorious than his association with Charles Manson. In 1968, Dennis picked up two female hitchhikers and brought them to his Sunset Boulevard home. Those women were members of the so-called Manson family, and soon after, Charles Manson himself was staying at Dennis's house. What began as a casual encounter spiraled into one of the darkest chapters of his life. Manson, an aspiring musician, charmed Dennis with his songs and philosophies. For months, Dennis provided Manson and his followers with food, shelter, and money. At one point, nearly 20 members of the family were living in his home. Dennis was captivated not just by Manson, but by the sense of community the group seemed to represent. Yet beneath the surface, Manson's manipulative and violent tendencies were beginning to show. Dennis tried to help Manson get a record deal, even introducing him to producer Terry Melcher. But when things didn't work out, Manson turned against the Hollywood elite. Just a year later, the Manson family committed the infamous Tate LaBianca murders, shocking the world. Dennis, horrified by his proximity to the cult, never fully recovered from the association. He rarely spoke about it publicly, but privately it haunted him. Friends said he felt guilt for having let Manson into his life and fear over how close he had come to unimaginable violence. While his personal life spiraled, Dennis's music began to evolve. He started writing songs that reflected his inner turmoil, filled with melancholy, longing, and vulnerability. Unlike the sun-soaked anthems of the Beach Boys, Dennis's music was raw and deeply personal. In 1970, he released Forever, a song so beautiful that even Brian called it the most heartfelt ballad any of them had ever written. Dennis's voice, rough and emotional, carried an authenticity that set him apart. He was proving that he wasn't just the pretty face or the drummer. He was an artist with something important to say. That artistic breakthrough culminated in his 1977 solo album Pacific Ocean, Blue. The album was unlike anything the Beach Boys had ever released. It was soulful, gritty, and hauntingly beautiful. Critics praised it, and it developed a cult following that has only grown with time. Songs like River Song and Thoughts of You revealed Dennis at his most vulnerable, grappling with loneliness, regret, and fleeting moments of hope. The album didn't sell well initially, partly because of poor promotion and partly because Dennis's personal struggles undermined his career. But decades later, it's regarded as a masterpiece, proof that Dennis was far more than the band's wild brother. Yet for every creative triumph, Dennis's personal life collapsed further. His marriages failed, his children grew distant, and his addictions consumed him. He became increasingly erratic, often disappearing for days, living on boats, and drinking himself into oblivion. Friends described him as both the life of the party and the loneliest man in the room. He had everything: fame, money, talent, but he couldn't outrun the demons that had followed him since childhood. By the early 1980s, Dennis's life was unraveling. His voice was deteriorating from years of smoking and drinking, and he was kicked out of the Beach Boys at times because of his behavior. He lived on borrowed time, drifting between moments of clarity and chaos. And then, in December 1983, the chaos finally caught up with him. On December 28, 1983, Dennis Wilson drowned in Marina del Rey, Los Angeles. He was only 39 years old. That day, he had been drinking heavily and diving into the harbor, reportedly searching for items he had thrown overboard from his yacht years earlier. Friends begged him to stop, but Dennis laughed it off. Hours later, he vanished beneath the water. The man who had introduced the world to surfing, who had embodied the carefree spirit of California, died in the ocean that had always been his sanctuary. His death shocked the music world. The Beach Boys were devastated, and fans struggled to reconcile the tragedy with the image of the golden-haired surfer they had loved. At his funeral, Dennis was remembered not just as a beach boy, but as a complex, troubled, and brilliant man whose life burned too brightly to last. At the request of then-President Ronald Reagan, Dennis was buried at sea, the only beach boy to ever receive such an honor. It was a fitting end for a man who had always felt most at home in the water. But death didn't erase the questions. What could Dennis Wilson have achieved if he had been given more time? Would he have overcome his demons? Could his music have finally received the recognition it deserved? In many ways, his legacy is one of unfulfilled potential. And yet, perhaps that's what makes him so hauntingly unforgettable. His songs, especially Pacific Ocean Blue, carry the weight of a man who lived on the edge, who loved deeply, hurt deeply, and expressed it all through music. Today, Dennis Wilson is remembered as the beach boy who lived the closest to the dream and suffered the hardest from the reality. He was reckless, tender, flawed, and brilliant. His life serves as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the fragility of genius. For all his chaos, Dennis left behind something pure, music that still speaks to those who have felt lost, broken, or misunderstood. His voice, rough and imperfect, reminds us that beauty often comes not from perfection, but from honesty. And maybe that's the real story of Dennis Wilson. He wasn't the best musician, the most famous songwriter, or the most reliable performer, but he was real. In an industry built on illusions, Dennis gave the world something true. And though his life ended far too soon, his music and his spirit remain, echoing like waves against the shore, forever restless, forever unforgettable. Even after Dennis Wilson's tragic passing, the waves of his story didn't stop rolling. In fact, some would argue that the myth of Dennis grew even larger in the decades after his death. His absence created a void, and into that void poured speculation, admiration, and rediscovery. Fans who once saw him as the Wild Wilson brother began revisiting his work with new eyes. Songs like Farewell My Friend, which he had written years earlier as a tribute to a loved one, sounded eerily prophetic, as though Dennis had been composing his own goodbye. Listening to it today feels like standing in the silence after a storm, when the ocean is calm but the memory of chaos still lingers. The tragedy of Dennis Wilson is not just that he died young, it's that he spent much of his life overlooked. While Brian was hailed as a genius and might commanded attention as the frontman, Dennis was seen as the troublemaker, the unreliable one, the brother who never quite lived up to his potential. Yet, when you strip away the myths and the scandals, Dennis was perhaps the most human of them all. He didn't hide behind perfection or polish. His music and his life revealed raw wounds, fleeting joys, and the desperate desire to connect. That vulnerability is what keeps his legacy alive even now. In the years since his death, Pacific Ocean Blue has achieved near-mythical status. Critics who ignored it in 1977 now describe it as a lost masterpiece. Young musicians cite Dennis as an influence, and fans who never knew him in life discover his work and are struck by how modern, emotional, and timeless it feels. The album is often compared to Van Morrison's Astral Weeks, a deeply personal, almost spiritual statement that doesn't fit neatly into any category, but speaks directly to the soul. For Dennis, who spent much of his life doubting himself, that posthumous recognition is bittersweet. It proves he always had something extraordinary inside him. The tragedy is that he didn't live long enough to see it celebrated. Dennis's story is also a reminder of the dark undercurrents beneath the California dream. The Beach Boys sold an image of sun, surf, and carefree youth, but the reality was far more complicated. Brian struggled with mental illness, Carl carried the weight of peacemaking, and Dennis was consumed by addiction and chaos. Behind the harmonies, the Wilson brothers were haunted by the scars of their fathers, abuse, and the pressures of fame. Dennis, more than anyone, embodied that contradiction: the surfer who drowned, the heartthrob who felt unloved, the rock star who longed for peace but chased destruction. And yet, for all his flaws, Dennis Wilson lived fully. Friends recalled his generosity, his infectious laugh, and his ability to make even the most mundane moment feel like an adventure. He could be reckless, yes, but also tender in ways that surprised those who truly knew him. He was a man of contradictions, violent yet gentle, destructive yet creative, lost yet searching. That complexity is why people remain fascinated by him today. Standing on the edge of his legacy, one can't help but wonder what Dennis would make of the world now. Would he be proud to know that his music continues to touch lives decades later? Would he find comfort in the fact that many finally recognize his artistry, not just his scandals? Or would he brush it all off with a shrug, choosing instead to dive back into the ocean, chasing waves as though nothing else mattered? The truth is, Dennis was never easy to define, and maybe that's why his story resonates so strongly. His drowning in Marina del Rey was not just the end of a life, but the closing of a metaphor. The ocean had been his playground, his muse, his escape, and finally, his grave. That image of Dennis disappearing beneath the waves remains one of the most haunting in rock history, but perhaps it's also fitting. The ocean doesn't end. It shifts, it changes, it lives on. And so does Dennis Wilson through the ripples of his music, the stories of those who loved him, and the fans who continue to discover him anew. So, what do we take away from Dennis Wilson's life? Maybe it's this: that perfection is overrated, that beauty often comes from brokenness, that living fully, even recklessly, leaves behind something unforgettable. Dennis didn't give the world polished genius like Brian, or consistency like Carl. He gave us himself, unfiltered, imperfect, but real. And in a world built on image and illusion, that truth is worth remembering. As the credits roll on his story, we're left with the sound of waves, the echo of a rough, soulful voice, and the reminder that sometimes the brightest flames burn out the fastest. Dennis Wilson was more than a beach boy. He was a dreamer, a drifter, a lover, a fighter, and an artist who poured his soul into every note. His life may have ended at 39, but his spirit continues to crash against the shore, eternal as the tides. And if you've made it this far, maybe you feel it to that pull, that ache, that beauty in his tragedy. That's the gift Dennis left behind. And now we want to hear from you. What do you think Dennis Wilson's legacy truly is? Was he the heart of the Beach Boys, the soul they never fully understood, or something even more? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'll be reading every single one. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit the like button. Share this video with someone who loves music history, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of legends whose lives were as unforgettable as their songs. Until next time, keep the music alive.